The title of this session is Jews at a Crossroad, Migration, Culture and Biography in Early 20th Century Germany. We have three speakers, and then we have a commentator who will join us via Zoom. We will keep the talks short, so we will have time to have a discussion afterwards. Our first speaker is Dr. Viola-Rautenberg. Viola is currently a Minerva postdoctoral fellow at the Bucerius Center at Haifa University. She received her PhD in 2018 from the TU in Berlin. She received several grants and fellowships all over the world, in Germany, in the United States, and in Israel. I can proudly say that from tomorrow, or the day after tomorrow, she will be part of a research project together with Professor Ulrike Pilarczyk and myself at the Hebrew University, that is related to youth emigration, and I'm very glad to say that her book, no longer "Ladies and Gentlemen, Gender and German-Jewish Migration to Modern Palestine," is forthcoming. Will be shortly out. So look for the book. And today Viola will speak about the topic of the book. Thank you very much, Viola.
All right, so thank you for the introduction, Ofer, and thanks to Anya for organizing, and thanks to Elizabeth, who we can't see, but for joining us, but I hope you can hear us all well. This here is the one forum, I believe, where I do not have to make an introduction to the subject of this talk, the German-Jewish migration to modern Palestine, after 33. So what I will do in the next 15 minutes is, first of all, to argue that we have to understand this migration as a gendered process on all levels. And then second, that using gender as a tool here can open up this field to much broader questions beyond this very specific group of immigrants. Okay, so I will start with a quotation. I will read in German. You can read along the translation in English. These are the lyrics of a song written in 1940 by a recent immigrant, Leni Grünstein, who settled in Beit Yitzhak. And it goes like that. Als wir einst ins Land herkamen, waren Herren wir und Damen. Anders ist es heute. Arbeitsanzug unsere Mode, Primus unsere Kochmethode, haben niemals Zeit. Arbeitstag währt 15 Stunden, Bäuche sind dahingeschwunden, Anzug war zu weit. Mit Turea und Spaten sind als Beit Yitzhak-Soldaten wir stets kampfbereit. Fort mit Lippenstift und Smoking, fort mit Frack, denn das ist shocking. Fort das Abendkleid, weil ab jetzt dem Hühnerzüchten, Kühe melken, Felder richten wir uns ganz geweiht. It's the end of the quotation. So immigration to Palestine, as we all know, brought about radical change for these migrants. Downward social mobility, the loss of their former profession, class affiliation, etc. In my book, I argue that crucial to these all-encompassing shifts that they underwent were changing gender relations. And this song by Grünstein speaks directly to these changes. So as she writes, she and her peers arrived as ladies and gentlemen, terms that are deeply connected to both gender and class. And from their migration to Palestine, there was a transformation from lipstick and from evening gowns for the ladies and tailcoats and tuxedos of the gentlemen to these uniform work clothes for both sexes. So we have a sartorial metaphor for gender change here in this song. Now, the research literature, and I will just say 2 sentences here, on this migration has largely concentrated on 2 issues. First, the level of integration of these immigrants into society, and secondly, their contributions to the emerging state of Israel. And then since the 1990s, research has begun using different methodologies like oral history and autobiography-based research. And as a result, questions more of experience, of memory, of identity have been brought to the fore. Now, no work to date has addressed the question of gender in this migration. There are a few studies that discuss the experience of women and even fewer about men. Most of them are based on memoirs, on oral history. But they do not use gender as a relational category. So they do not consider both men and women, their relation to each other, and nor do they examine gender as a structural element. And this is true, by the way, for much of Jewish gender history, the field that I'm coming from, where gender today still stands in for women's history or less often for men's history. Now, in general, it's impossible to understand any migration movement without a gendered analysis. From the macro perspective, we have the policies of both the sending and the receiving countries that offer different opportunities for men and women. And from the micro perspective, migration transforms the individual immigrants' gender relations, their family life, their body, their sexuality, etc. Now, under sedentary conditions, so pre-migration conditions, such change usually takes many, many years. But migration propels these processes, so it reshuffles the cards, so to speak, which is why it's so interesting to study this case of migration from a gender perspective. So what I do in my book, and I show you a different picture, this very nice picture again, what I do in my book is to look closely at the first decade of this migration, so from 33 until the early 40s, in order to shed light precisely on the role that gender had in these times of turmoil, and these were really times of turmoil for the migrants. And I do that based largely on contemporary documents, and not on documents conducted in hindsight, because I want to look, what I wanted, because I finished with the book, on gender in a lot of different spheres, the private and the public, different scenes, the ship, the working place, the cafe, the kitchen, the sleeping room, and also different perspectives of both the immigrants, the absorbing society, and the veteran society. So what I will do now is to zoom in just to a few of these aspects, and I will leave a few out, but we can talk about that later. So when we look at the macro perspective of this migration, what we see is that gender shaped the conditions, first of all, for immigration, for leaving Nazi Germany, and it also structured how immigration was controlled through the specific regulations of both the British Mandate and the Jewish Agency. Each of these two bodies had their own policies, their own agendas, but it's safe to say that women were disadvantaged in the allocation of visas by both of them. What we see, for example, when we look at the data from the border control, so those who actually entered Palestine, is that the ratio of men to women was 52% men, 5-2, to 48% women, 4-8, so 52 to 48, which seems almost equal, right? But men and women entered Palestine on different certificates and with a different status, which was very crucial for the later process for them. Men mainly as owners of the certificates and women mainly as the dependents. And second, as you might know, the Jewish population in Nazi Germany, so in 1933, the ratio was exactly the other way around. So it was 52% women to 48% men. So in other words, women and men who were eager to leave Nazi Germany and come to Mandate Palestine did not have the same chance to enter Palestine. These gendered policies from the macro had many, many different impacts, of course, on the micro. For example, in order for unmarried women to receive a certificate to enter, a flourishing market of personal ads arose in order to find a partner with a certificate. And these ads are, by the way, excellent sources for looking at changing anticipations of gender, changing roles. And another example is that these policies led to the practice of chain migration. So men came oftentimes before their spouses, usually several months before their spouses, which was based on gendered assumptions, and it also had gendered consequences, both for the women who stayed behind in Nazi Germany and also for the men who already settled in Palestine. Okay, so that is really from the macro of the policies. Now, the second point I want to make here is regarding gender as a central element in the policies of the absorbing bodies in Palestine. These absorbing bodies consisted mainly of the immigrant self-help organization Germania, the Association of Immigrants from Germany, and the German department within the Jewish Agency. And both of them made really a massive effort to monitor these immigrants and to intervene in their integration, both their integration into the public sphere, into the labor market, and also into this private sphere. So, for example, into questions of homemaking, of families, etc. These absorbing bodies worried in the 1930s that the immigrants would fail to integrate. And when we read all of these reports that were conducted in the 1930s, we can see that they perceived this situation as a potential crisis, and as a crisis that was gendered. Because those who were seen as particularly in crisis were men, and more precisely family fathers over the age of 35. And these men, as this data shows us, often failed to support their families in Palestine because of a range of reasons. They were unemployed or underemployed, lack of Hebrew, insufficient training, also psychological and physical problems, which led to the description of all of them, and that is really unisono in all these documents from the time, as men that were living in a void, that were bitter, frustrated, complainers, etc. So precisely those who had in Germany been the main breadwinners became really the epitome of problematic immigrants here in the eyes of the authorities in this migration. A void developed, and this void had to be filled, and it was filled by women, to prevent a social crisis here for this immigrant group. Now, many married women, given the severe economic situation of their families, entered the workforce shortly after their arrival in Palestine. They mostly worked as unskilled workers in the domestic or informal sector, in brackets just as today, the same that female immigrants do today all over the world. Most of us know that in Germany before migration, the German Jewish middle-class homeworkers had primarily been responsible for the household, for the upbringing of the children. So this changed really drastically after the migration. They were still expected to perform the traditional roles, motherhood, homemaking, but now they also had to provide for their families. So this breadwinner homemaker model from Germany was over, which had obviously many, many consequences on the micro level, but I will not go into that right now. In all of the reports and in the newspaper coverage of these immigrant newspapers of the time, there was this contrast of problematic men on the one side, and then hardworking, brave, tough, determined, and self-sacrificing women on the other side. And this is a continuation of debates from Nazi Germany that were brought to Palestine. It is, by the way, also a topos that appears in the research literature often very uncritically. But despite this praise for the female immigrants, the apparatus operated from a position of bias. And to give you just one example here, they were well aware that female immigrants, for example, were seen as cheap labor in the Yishuv, being paid sometimes 50 to 70% less, 7-0, but they were not protesting these policies. So the last area that I want to look at, the third and last, is the place of gender in the encounter with the Yishuv and the Society of Mandatory Palestine. Now, the immigrants arrived while the Yishuv was in an intensive period of nation building, and there was profound criticism directed at the immigrants, which included all aspects of their life and decisively targeted private, intimate aspects, what they bought, how they cooked, how they cleaned, how they dressed. And gender was crucial in this criticism. Women really figured prominently in this criticism. For example, there was a readers' letters controversy in the immigrant newspapers because the German Jewish women were blamed for looking and behaving like Kurfürstendamen in the terminology of the time, so the ladies from the Kurfürstendamm, the famous Berlin Boulevard. That means, that was a buzzword then, but what it means, just to spell it out, is behaving like vain, fancy, bourgeois, egoistical women who only care about the latest fashion and not about building up the country. And another example are the debates about the moral stamina of female immigrants from Germany, and that is, of course, giving the Yishuv's attempts of boundary construction between Jews and non-Jews in the period. So there was an anxiety that single female immigrants from Germany might engage in sexual relationships with non-Jewish men, or in commercial sex and prostitution, especially in the port cities, in Tel Aviv and Haifa, which were anyhow seen as dangerous mixing grounds for these young, unexperienced women, in quotations, with British soldiers on leave or Arab men. So important to point out that men were not discussed in this context, but the focus here was on women, who were those who had to serve as gatekeepers by avoiding intermingling with non-Jewish men. And then finally, that's the last thing I will say before I conclude, is that there is the place of gender also in the interactions with all the different groups that made up mandatory Palestinian society, both Jewish and non-Jewish. In the eyes of the immigrants from Germany, all of these groups that they encountered, apart from the British, which is another interesting point, all of them belonged to the East in varying degrees. So the Mizrahim, in today's terminology, Arabs, and very decidedly also Eastern European Jews. And to make just one last remark here, before I conclude, regarding encounters with Mizrahim in today's terminology, these encounters between German Jews and Mizrahim took place primarily in the realm of social workers, so female social workers from Germany and women from Mizrahi communities. And the main topics here were questions of hygiene, of homemaking, and of motherhood. Now, there are several studies that were published recently, Israeli studies, that touch upon German professional women in these fields, in medicine and social work, and in education and mandatory Palestine, that all aim to highlight the role of women here and the contributions that they made to these fields. But these studies often omit how these women perceived themselves in contrast to Mizrahi women. And as I would argue, such perceptions and related questions of power, of superiority, were crucial to the immigrants' efforts to find their place in this new society that they just came to. Because Orientalism for these immigrants was not simply a scholarly discipline for a few professional Orientalists and teachers of Arabic, but it was a daily practice for the majority of these immigrants, and it was intersected with questions of gender and class. And with that, I will conclude that writing gender into the history of these migrations can question historical assumptions about this immigration wave, its place in the emerging society of Israel, and also about the German Jewish immigration in general, because rather than following the dominant approaches in the research literature, gender can actually be used here as an excellent tool to approach conflict, crisis, contested contact, etc. And then ultimately, looking at migration in general through a gendered lens can always enable us to understand this category of gender in its very construction and reconstruction, and that is important today just as it was in the 1930s. Thank you very much.